Today, we are going to unpack a really important paper from the Journal of Affective Disorders. We're looking at a pretty radical new frontier in mental health, the idea of using the human voice as a precise, objective biomarker for diagnosing and even monitoring depression. We're going to break down all the key findings from this massive study. So we'll walk through this in 5 parts. First, we'll look at the diagnostic challenge this research is trying to solve. Then we'll get into how exactly the study decodes the voice. After that, we'll dive into the core findings. What are the specific vocal signatures of depression? Then, we'll see how those signatures actually change with treatment. And finally, we'll talk about what this could all mean for the future of mental health care. Okay, so let's start with the fundamental problem here. How do we currently diagnose and track depression? This is really where you start to see why we need this kind of innovation so badly. Right now, the gold standard relies on subjective rating scales in clinical interviews. And look, those are absolutely essential, but they have their limits, right? They can be affected by a patient's own recall bias or even vary from one clinician to another. The goal here is to develop what are called acoustic biomarkers, data that's passive, non-invasive, and can be captured remotely with something as simple as a smartphone. The whole idea is that the very physiology of how we produce our voice is altered by depression, and that gives us a direct, measurable signal. So, to tackle this huge question, the researchers put together an incredibly well-designed study. You have to understand, this wasn't just some small pilot project. It was a large-scale, multi-cohort investigation specifically designed to make sure that whatever they found was not only significant, but also reproducible. The study involved almost 2,000 people, and they were split into 3 distinct groups. First, there was a large discovery cohort, which was used to identify potential vocal features in the first place. Then, and this part is so crucial for good science, they used an independent validation cohort to test and confirm those findings. Finally, they had a longitudinal cohort that was followed for 8 weeks, specifically to track how these vocal biomarkers change as someone goes through treatment. And this slide lays out their method perfectly. It starts with collecting voice samples from people using a standardized app. From those raw recordings, they extracted a huge number of acoustic features. This incredibly high-dimensional data then went through a really rigorous statistical process to filter out all the noise and pinpoint the signals that were actually meaningful. And when I say a huge number, I really mean it. Using a standardized toolkit, the researchers initially extracted over 6,000 distinct acoustic features for every single participant. I mean, think about that. The real challenge, of course, is how do you find the handful of features in that mountain of data that are genuinely, meaningfully linked to depression? All right, now let's get to the results. This is where we see the heart of what the study actually found, the specific vocal fingerprint, if you will, of major depressive disorder. So, after all that incredibly rigorous filtering across multiple data sets, those thousands upon thousands of initial features were boiled down to just 69. These are the really robust, reproducible features that consistently and significantly could tell the difference between individuals with depression and healthy controls. Now, what's so fascinating here is which kinds of features turned out to be the most important. It wasn't the simple stuff you might guess, like pitch or volume. Nope. The most powerful markers actually came from what are called the spectral and cepstral domains. These are really complex features that have to do with the resonance of your vocal tract and how precise your articulation is. So basically, it's about how you shape sounds, not just how high or low your voice is. But the study went even deeper. They started categorizing these features by how they change with the severity of depression. The first type they found are these early sensitive features. These are markers that show a really big change right at the beginning when someone goes from healthy to mild or moderate, but then they kind of level off. This makes them potentially perfect for early detection and screening. The second type they identified are consistent sensitive features. Now, unlike that first group, these markers change steadily across the entire spectrum of severity, from healthy all the way to severe. This clear, linear relationship makes them ideal for objectively monitoring how a patient's condition is progressing or, hopefully, improving over time. And these plots show that difference so clearly. Up top, you see the early sensitive features, where that big change happens right at the start. And on the bottom, you can see the consistent sensitive features, showing that steady, step-by-step change as severity goes up. These 2 different patterns really point to 2 very different clinical uses, one for screening and the other for monitoring.
What's really crucial here is that depression doesn't just have one single sound. This diagram shows that different clusters of symptoms actually have their own unique acoustic signatures. So for example, somatic symptoms, things like fatigue or changes in appetite, are linked to changes in spectral band energy, but depressed mood itself is linked more to changes in pitch modulation. The fact that these vocal signatures are mostly separate suggests that we could one day use the voice to really dissect an individual's specific profile of symptoms.
So that brings us to the longitudinal part of the study. You know, it's one thing to diagnose, but can we actually use the voice to track recovery? This is where we explore how these vocal biomarkers change when patients are getting treatment. And the answer was a pretty definitive yes. The analysis found that 38 of these acoustic features changed significantly over an 8-week treatment period. This confirms that the voice is highly sensitive to clinical improvement over time. But, recovery isn't just one simple straight line. The researchers found several different trajectories. Some vocal features showed what they called normalization, where they went all the way back to healthy levels. Others showed attenuated abnormality, meaning they got better but didn't fully recover. And some even showed a rebound pattern, where they improved at first and then fluctuated. So based on these different vocal paths, the patients themselves could actually be grouped into distinct clusters. You had a quick recovery cluster, which was characterized by changes in spectral shape. These patients showed rapid improvement in just 2 weeks, which suggests these features could be an early sign that a treatment is working. In contrast, you had the slow recovery cluster, which often showed a more gradual, incomplete improvement, with features related to energy and voice quality pointing to some lingering impairment. Now, this is a really critical scientific check. The researchers had to ask, are these voices just changing because time is passing, or are they changing because the symptoms of depression are actually getting better? Through what's called a mediation analysis, they proved it. They showed that reductions in the clinical depression scores were the direct cause of the changes in the acoustic features. This really solidifies the conclusion that vocal recovery is a direct proxy for clinical improvement.
So what does this all add up to? Let's zoom out for a second and look at the path from these research findings to what could become a clinical reality.
Of course, like any good scientific study, the authors are upfront about the limitations. The validation and longitudinal groups were smaller than that initial discovery cohort. An 8-week follow-up might miss longer-term patterns, and other factors, like the effects of specific medications, still need more study. It's really important to acknowledge these are the areas for future research.
But the take-home message here is really powerful and clear. First, complex spectral and cepstral features are way more robust than simple things like pitch and loudness. Second, different vocal signatures map onto specific clusters of symptoms. Third, the voice is sensitive to changes over time, which allows us to track both quick and slow recovery patterns. And finally, all of this points toward real clinical viability, a compact set of markers that can support objective, remote, and personalized mental health monitoring.
And that leaves us with a really provocative final thought. As this technology gets better and more integrated into the devices that we all carry around every day, how might this kind of continuous passive monitoring fundamentally reshape the future of mental health care, making it more personalized, more proactive, and ultimately more accessible for everyone?